Chloe Donovan, welcome to Thinking Aloud. Chloe is the Managing Director of Natural Building Systems and Material Research Limited. Her and her team are leading the way to sustainable construction with innovative, award-winning, carbon-negative, bio-based modular systems. We'll definitely learn more about that as we go through today, as well as her role in construction. Chloe is a passionate advocate for decarbonisation in agriculture and farming, having founded a farm-based social enterprise, and has been recognised by Forbes twice, as we'll come on to, within the Forbes 30 under 30 and the UK's top 100 female environmentalists. So today, Chloe, we're going to be looking at how creative thinking has helped you and has coloured the way your path to success, from building a team of experts to developing sustainable materials and systems and decarbonisation solutions. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
It's nice. I do have to say before we start that I have actually met you on quite a number of occasions before. I've seen you at various award ceremonies. I saw you at the ASBP one when you won an award there, and it seems to be becoming a habit, but well done for doing so. I wanted to start off, Chloe, with sort of, so for those people who are listening who perhaps don't know you, but I mean, you do have a fairly unique journey here because you started off in farming and also working in the charitable sector. Tell us about that, a little bit about that, and then when your thinking began to orientate around the business opportunities or the opportunities it was seeing that would take you from agriculture to construction to eventually where you are now.
Yeah, I guess it is a bit of an unusual journey. And I think really it starts when I was in my teenage years and I got involved in volunteering through, school activities. I was a member of the youth parliament, which was a bit of a random adventure at the time, but it led me to working for a national charity and getting really interested in the kind of systems thinking, and in particular I worked for a campaign that was all about trying to increase the amount of young people in volunteering, and that was generally around recognizing other organizations that were doing great work. I helped run awards, I did coordination of a youth forum and various other bits, but it got me really interested in, like, what is it that empowers younger people in particular to feel like they can have a positive impact on the world around them, because growing up as a millennial myself, the world can be a pretty depressing place sometimes, and I think it was really just an interest in the world at large that is partly what has led me here. I've always been a generalist. I've never kind of found that specific niche. I've dabbled in lots of things. I've always had a very broad interest in kind of making and creating and doing things. But I also have a deep interest and passion for the environment and for the natural world. My mum's a big hippie, and it was with her that I used what I'd learned working in charities and the voluntary sector to set up a farm-based social enterprise that's taking parents and children together and engaging them in kind of farm-based activities, nature-based workshops, etc. And so it's a bit of a segue to have gone from that to construction manufacturing. But really, it was through an interest in food and farming systems. So I was interested in farming from the perspective of, I helped run a farmer's market that my grandparents set up for a number of years as the token millennial who did all the website and the social media. But I think my experience in charities, becoming a trustee of a few charities and supporting in these kind of farming business endeavors, really is where I cut my teeth on kind of business management and understanding, finances. Whether you're a charity or a business, you have to be able to read a P&L sheet, picked up a lot of generalist knowledge in that space. And yeah, was really looking for opportunities to support my grandparents to diversify their farm. And that was when I first became interested in the potential to grow construction materials, because there's a massive amount of biomass that is currently being grown to be converted into bioenergy, whether that's through incineration or through biogas plants. And I was basically seeing lots of farms that used to grow food, switching to growing energy crops or diversifying into glamping pods and things, because farming is surprisingly a subsistence lifestyle. It's very hard for farmers to actually make any serious money from their farming activities, and just kind of basically wanted to try and help. And so I set out to find a reason to get them to grow crops that would both bring in an income, but also do something good to the planet and the environment and biodiversity. And so that was the starting point. And yeah, I'm 5 years down the track in terms of co-founding Natural Building Systems. But that's kind of how it started.
So there is a hemp connection here, isn't there? Because if I remember rightly, didn't either your grandparents farmed or you got them to grow hemp?
I wanted to get them to grow hemp, and that's where this all started. They were, like lots of farms, growing maize for a biodigester. And to diversify and bring in a bit of extra income, I supported them and my mum in particular to start a maize. So like kids come around and get stamps, and the same field was growing the maize every year because of the infrastructure we built. And as a result, that it was really struggling. It was on like year 10, and it was kind of really starting to drop yields and things. So I started looking at what else we could grow, and hemp was a potential dual crop because it can be a food crop. It could be used. They were a very small farm. They started also doing artisan ice cream. And so I thought, oh, we could make some, this was like 10 years ago. So I was like, oh, we could make some vegan ice cream, and we could, and knowing what I know now, we're still, sadly, the UK is a long way off having fields of hemp that you can go and frolic around in. But it was really unpacking the barriers and the challenges in terms of why aren't farmers growing this crop that has these massive amount of biodiversity, carbon, soil benefits. Really, there's a kind of a supply chain issue. I basically was like, if I convince them to grow the hemp, I've got to convince someone to buy it.
Where did you learn about hemp? I mean, when you think about it, there are certain regions, there are certain other plants as well. I mean, linseed would be another one, flax. So there are a certain number of grown plants which have a long history. In fact, we've got place names named after them, especially in your neck of the world as well. So where did you go and get this knowledge about hemp from? Because it is a multifaceted, it is a very universal crop. You can use it for lots of things, and it has very positive effects in terms of rotational cropping for farmers as well. So where did you, by your own admission, don't come from a farming background, where did you go and find out about all of this?
So it was farming conferences really where I first heard about it. And through some personal connections, I knew some people that had been involved in a small scale kind of hemp farming project where they were processing it into their own oil-based product. So like pharmaceutical kind of world, and they had quite a high profile case where, because they were processing the seeds themselves, they basically had to destroy the crop because they were breaking the rules at the time around licensing of, even though you can buy CBD products, you can go in Holland and Barrett and buy a CBD based product, it's actually, and I think it's still the case, that it's not legal for a farmer to grow the seeds and process them into their own oils and sell their own oils. They can sell those seeds to Europe and buy back a product, which is what some of them are now doing. But we've got very backwards laws around the licensing. Anyway, they had a very high profile case. They were on BBC News where they had to destroy their crop because they'd fallen foul of these licensing restrictions. And I guess that was one of the bits that kind of, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Why are they being made to destroy the crop? And then when I went to a farming conference and heard about the massive environmental benefits, I mean, it really is a wonder crop. And the funny thing was, at these farming conferences, there's the majority of people, there was a couple of real hemp enthusiasts, and the rest of the room or the conference, generally you'd see people start rolling their eyes when these particular characters got up to talk. And usually they were just bang on about hemp. And now I'm one of them.
Well, it's funny. I do remember that I went to I think it was one of the German industrial shows, and I met a company there called Biofib, who from France, and they had, as giveaways, they had hemp baseball caps and hemp bits and pieces. They had hemp T-shirts as well. All of the hemp baseball caps, of course, had what looked like a cannabis leaf right on the front, which was slightly incongruous. But no, I mean, it's well known. So the versatility of crop is well known, and although it carries connotations with the construction sector, we can come on to that in a bit. So what all of this is telling me is that your specialism is generalism, effectively. So what you're saying is you've managed to harvest it all together. When did you begin to think to yourself, actually, hang on a minute, there might be something else in here? Because it's an even bigger leap from someone whose grandparents are involved in farming to thinking, I'm going to set up a research company that manufactures construction materials or build systems. That's the bit that intrigues me as well, because what prompted that? Because I can kind of see how, of all the things you've said, how working within teams, about persuading people of different views, about getting involved with things which are potentially contentious or maybe regulated, which farming is. It said, I can see all of that would have helped. But the next bit is a mystery to me, because it's, I'm sure we'd like to hear how you made that leap.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I guess having an interest in kind of community development and I guess in citizenship and how we engage in our societies, both as young people, but also into adulthood. Like I was doing a lot of work looking at the data around, you know, what is it that makes people want to help other people and to engage in the types of activities that ultimately lead to kind of collective improvements. And you can't really get away from the fact that housing and the built environment is the bedrock of the kind of quality of housing. And you know, my generation is the generation that are predominantly into their 30s and some people even into their 40s, where the numbers of people still living at home with their parents is through the roof. And, you know, everyone has gripes. I live in a shared house even still. Lots of people of my generation just can't afford basic housing. And it's like, how can you build something where people are able to like contribute to others and improve others when their own quality of living, you know, some of the Panorama episodes and things I've had recently around the state of the UK's housing being the coldest, moldiest in the UK. And so when I kind of landed on getting interested in hemp and what it can be used for, and then I discovered that actually when you turn it into a construction material, it has exceptional properties in terms of improving the quality of the housing, breathability, moisture buffering, reducing damp and mold. You know, it's got these, some of them are very unique because of the poor structure of the material on a kind of microscopic level. But I was just like, what do you mean we could grow housing? Like, we're in a housing crisis. We could be growing something
We've done this for
good for
centuries.
farms, good for farmers, stores carbon and makes housing more available and healthier. You know, that just seemed to me like, I think, you know, I've never really known what I wanted to do in life. I have always just gone from one thing to the next and followed my interests, but this really felt like something where it was like, this seems too good to be true. And I was very lucky to have worked already up in London. I did a kind of bit of work for someone who had a background in property and developing mainly retrofitting old buildings in London, but had done some new builds. And so initially I basically approached him and said, would you be interested in building some stuff out of hemp if I grew a whole bunch of it? Because that was where I started. I was like, growing it is actually quite easy. Obviously, there's massive challenges with getting licensing and jumping through hoops. But in terms of, you know, it's known as weed because it will grow literally anywhere. It doesn't need a great deal of inputs and fertilizers. So that bit was easy. But then it's like, well, you know, if you grew a couple of acres of it, then what? And that was the starting point for actually thinking about integrating it within construction technology innovation. And my business partner having a background in design and art, but also having a deep interest in buildings and a frustration with the wasteful nature of construction. I said, do you want to build something out of hemp? And he said, oh, I've never heard of this before. What about putting it in a pre-constructed panelized kit of parts? And I was like, that would be interesting. And so we initially set out just to build one prototype building. We were going to build a cabin. I was going to grow the hemp. We were going to, you know, as a kind of proof of concept. And we still actually haven't built a cabin, ironically, of all the things we've now built, you know, classrooms and houses and bits. We actually haven't as yet built a cabin per se. But I think that's what it really evolved from. And it was then once you really start getting under the skin of the kind of opportunity that there exists within construction, aka within the housing crisis and the climate crisis, you know, actually, if we could scale what we're doing up significantly, it could have a massive impact. So I've always been a kind of purpose-driven person. And so this felt like a real purpose that could have tangible benefits for my generation and generations to come.
So this is going to lead to the ADEPT system, which I know about because I've seen it at Future Build. I've seen you there. It's the award-winning thing you've done. which part of the hemp plant are you actually using? Because obviously this is a sort of it's symbiotic in many ways, but the grower of the hemp, the farmer, if hemp was to be grown, will need to get something from it. But you're not using some of the most saleable parts of the crop. The seeds, for example, in the oil are more valuable effectively to the grower. So which bit are you using? And when we say hemp in building, what are we using?
Yeah, so that's something that initially I was naive about hemp. And so just to summarize, basically the plants can be 3 or 4 foot tall, like the small seed varieties, or they can be 12 foot tall, which is the industrial fiber varieties. And these are all part of the same family, but are very different plants. And I thought that you could both grow a variety for fiber that you could also grow seeds on. And there are mixed varieties. They do exist, dual cropping varieties, but actually generally they are quite different plants. And in the UK currently it's illegal to harvest the flowers and the leaves. That's the bit that and the seed is where you would extract the oil from that would go into into food, but also into the CBD kind of slightly more nootropic-y type applications, if that's the right word. But the industrial fiber variety is the variety that was historically grown significantly across the UK. So it was actually a legal requirement in the 1600s that if you had more than 30 acres of land, you had to grow an acre of hemp, and it was paid as a tax to the crown.
Wow.
It was used to create canvas. So the word cannabis and canvas is derivative.
I was going to say it's a member of the cannabis family. I mean, hence the licensing issues, etc. But are you then saying that the variety that you would grow in order for use for building materials doesn't fall into that category, or is it?
No, it's still part of the same family, but it's just very different varieties of plants. But the kind of historic fiber variety that would have been grown for the textile industry, so obviously pre-synthetic materials and pre-globalization, all fabrics were made out of either wool or flax or hemp, or basically things that we could grow here. And hemp was all canvas. So the British Navy basically was, if it wasn't for hemp,
Cannabis powered.
Probably wouldn't have happened.
Cannabis and rum.
Yeah, and it was a tax paid via the crown. So for it to now be basically prohibited, or to be a controlled crop, and to have the kind of opposite happening, that's only actually been in the last 100 years. But it used to be grown, massively across the UK. But yeah, so it's a different variety, and the bit we use is the stalk. So we don't use the flowers and the leaves or the seeds. The stalk
what happens to them? What happens to the flowers and leaves and seeds? Can they be sold for something? Are they used?
Yeah, so if you're growing a seed variety or a dual variety, then you can harvest the seeds. You can put them often into the oil industry as a substitute for, other oil-based crops. It can be used and put into products, or it can go into, low-value things like birdseed mixes and stuff like that. It's a source of protein, so it can go into either food or other areas. And then the flowers and the leaves, currently in the UK, you have to return them to the field. So you're not allowed to harvest them. They are controlled, because that is where the kind of allegedly the higher THC bit is, but also it's not. It's just that I think the government thinks they don't want to flood the market with fake weed. I don't know why that's their rule. But
so the bulk of the plant, I mean, a 12-foot plant, if you're taking the stalk, the bulk of it can go off. So tell it. I want to move on to adept and how you use the material. So you effectively take what's called shiv.
Yeah.
You take the shredded fibrous part of the plant. How do you turn that into a building material? Tell us about adept, and also tell us about hempsil, because you and your team were responsible for creating a binder. Yes. That's unique. I can see the little R symbol when I see it. I remember it. I think it's a registered trademark.
It is.
So, it is. Without giving away any secrets, but sure. So we've gone through the journey from you've got this wonderfully collaborative sort of experience of working with teams. You've spotted it. You are, like many of us, sort of you have hippie roots. You like to do the right thing. You think we can work together. You've had an idea, and then you've hit upon this by dint of your circumstances and research. You've hit upon the idea of using hemp, a plant that has a significant history as an industrial product in this country. And you think maybe, coupled with the observations I have about housing and and the quality of housing, we can make this into a building product. Yet again, another significant step
Yeah.
which you had to make. So tell us about how you made that step, and also your thought processes going through it. Because did you actually have a eureka moment, or was this a lot of smaller things aggregated together where they sort of, well, we'll find out where we should be going later?
No, I think definitely it was a lot of smaller things aggregated together. I think we kind of established we wanted to use hemp, and we started experimenting what that could look like. I went on a course and learned about hemp lime as a building material, which has been used for decades and is a very simple recipe. It's hemp lime or hemp shiv, lime and water, and it makes a kind of lightweight aggregate that is used as a replacement for infill materials. So it's not load bearing, but it can replace effectively the brickwork in a building. And we started experimenting with that. But obviously, in the context of a modular system, there are challenges with weight and manufacturing in terms of, how it responds to time more than anything. But basically, you put a lot of water in and it takes a long time to dry. So we were finding that it was causing problems. It was messy, it was slow. And we did explore other options, briefly entertained the idea of going down the mycelium route, which others have. But in the end, we approached an expert in hemp lime who was an academic from the University of Bath who we kind of said, look, this is what we're trying to do. This is the panel solution. So we're both in parallel looking at the materials, but also the engineering of the system as a manufactured kit of parts. And so had basically my business partner, who is our director of design, who was very much interested in the nuts and bolts and messing around with different ways of joining the panels together. We were engaging architects and engineers as a kind of collaborative effort on that side. And then I was looking more at the kind of material, fundamental, what we're actually making it out of piece and researching into that. And so we were very lucky to basically co-opt Dr. Mike Lawrence, who was a lecturer at the University of Bath, a specialist in hemp lime, explained all the problems we were having. And he basically said, I'm not surprised. We said, have you got any better ideas? He said, well, maybe, but I haven't really thought about it. And we were like, would you like to join us and kind of, and we can try and experiment and trial it together. So that's what he did. So that was where it really came from. And then just to bring it on to the product itself. So it's resulted in this panelized kit of parts for construction. And we actually use two different parts of the hemp plant within the panel. So there's two layers. One layer is using the fiber insulation. We use the lovely Indonature fiber that is manufactured up in Scotland using UK grown hemp. And then we also have our own composite, which is called Hempsil, which is using the wood chippy stalk of the plant. So the stalk has fibers on the outside, they're called bast fibers. But basically, once you process the hemp, you strip those fibers away, and the bit you're left with looks like wood chip. But that's the bit that we mix with our own binder, which is a different mineral, but it is very low.
Can you tell us what the binder is, or can you tell us?
Sadly not.
You can't, can you? I've tried this before and not got an answer from
I mean, it's a very readily available mineral. It's not rocket science. But the reason that we're a little guarded about the recipe itself is because part of the reason hemp lime hasn't been adopted more widely in the construction industry is because it's common knowledge and anyone can make it. It means that it's very hard to guarantee the performance and the quality of it if you're relying on the skills of craftspeople and skilled laborers to do it on site. When I went on the course about hemp lime, like the first half of the day was just looking at horror stories of people who've tried to do it and they've done it wrong for whatever reason, and it's had disastrous consequences. And we basically want to make sure that the material that we're putting out there is in some way controlled in terms of quality.
Consistent, yeah.
And that means it's able to be tested and certified, and so there's a reason why we're not announcing it to the world, but it's more around kind of that side of it than anything else.
So, and just on the hemp cell side and the board side of it, the curing for the board, just out of interest, is that done naturally, or is there a forced system, or is it a chemical cure?
So when we were trialing hemp lime, we tried all sorts to try and speed the process up, like putting the panels in a big box and baking it and trying industrial dehumidifiers, and we melted them and that didn't go very well. And we were finding that it was taking, I mean, an actual hemp line building, and Mike's research has shown that it can take upwards of 18 months for it to fully cure in throughout the wall. And that can delay your ability to plaster it. And it causes potentially other knock-on problems if you don't let it dry properly before you render it and basically potentially seal the moisture in. So the panels now, we just use a little bit of blown air, so no kind of heat involved whatsoever. And it means we've been able to reduce the drying time from effectively, 8 to 12 weeks down to 48 hours, which makes it a product much more suitable for manufacturing. And inside the panels, it's a lightweight infill, so we don't compress it particularly. It's designed to kind of provide moisture buffering, but also it's giving a bit of thermal mass and it's giving some insulating properties. But you can obviously compress it down and form a board product, which is something we're doing some work on using UK grown material and trying to kind of optimize the performance of it as a board product, which is an ongoing strand of research.
I mean, we've discussed this before, but because my thinking, I have two ways of thinking of this. You have people who have factories have what I call factory forward thinking, and customers have what I call shelf backwards thinking. So you've gone through this process. You've recognised that there's a sort of doing the right thing approach to this. Fits in with the way that you see the world, and you believe that would be better if we all behaved in this way more responsibly. And ended up creating effectively a mechanism or a process of combining hemp into a usable board and designing a system called the ADEPT system, which is effectively a building system. We'll come on to a minute, I hope, on where you can use that in a building and whether this is just a partitioning system, like a dry lining system, whether it's a structural system. The tendency of a lot of companies, I think, who have factories is to think that they always have brilliant ideas. And I suppose in many ways, we'll create this and then we'll work out a clever way to sell it. But I suspect, and largely because of what I understand of the way your business has behaved, you've also been thinking the other way around, which is what would the customer want? So tell me about how that thinking developed, turning what obviously let's just assume in the journey you've made the board and we're quite happy with it. And that's some significant reduction in time. Because you're right, the industry is shot through with a lot of myths, but a lot of realistic assessments of hemp building, which is it takes a very, very long time to dry, okay, which just doesn't suit modern construction methods. But if you've got a kit form or you've got a building that you can build, then you are in the business of basically supplying building materials. How do you and your business think shelf backwards? And how does that inform what you do in the factory and what you make?
Yeah, I mean, I think the guiding principle for us is that the challenge with these materials is they've very much been left in the kind of artisanal end of the market because of the cost associated and the skill required to be able to adequately use and install these materials, not to mention the risks of architects wanting to use these materials but needing to rely on the skills of other people to make sure it's correctly detailed. And there's a lot of risks associated with using bio-based materials because of what can happen if it goes wrong. And so from the beginning, our goal was always to basically bring these materials into the 21st century by combining them with a very kind of technology focused and digitally driven approach to using them. So trying to bring in digital manufacturing techniques. The construction industry itself is one of the slowest kind of innovation areas in the economy, and wanting to really set a precedent for, look, we actually have all of this amazing technology out there. And if you're not constrained, and this is something I think is a massive challenge, as so many manufacturers and product creators in the construction industry are constrained by the factories they already have. They've already invested a significant amount in a certain way of doing things. And the beauty for us coming in with a fresh slate was that we could kind of think bigger. And so the kit of parts is very much an engineered product. They are structural panels and it's jointed using a dry fit timber connection that relies on precision engineering to go together. That does mean that effectively the panels are made to precision fit, and obviously challenges around integrating that in existing buildings or dealing with tolerances and variability on site. That is a whole can of worms we can get onto if you like. But I think that for us, it's about as much as possible utilizing technology, but also I think it's also about, yeah, bringing the materials into the 21st century, combining it with technology, but also keeping a real focus on the sustainability and the performance of the product itself. We're very much trying to do things that, the thing is, if we were to say, so our goal is to do large scale, low rise residential house building, because that's the part of the market where modular solutions have struggled the most to get adoption, because no one wants to live in a house that's been, well, it's less appealing to live in a house that's just been picked from a catalogue of predefined, people want the ability to express themselves in their homes. Homes inevitably change over time. People want to add bits and take bits away. And so that's really the market that we're aiming at. But if we had started at the outset by saying that our target customer was large scale developers, we would have developed a product that looks very different to what the product that we have, because we're not solving a problem that the developers have. They don't care that we've designed a product that is designed for disassembly and adaptation, because they build to sell predominantly. And so I think for us, being very much purpose driven was almost liberating at the beginning, because there is an obsession in the kind of entrepreneurial innovation space where it's very much about like, what's the pain point you're solving for your customer. But I think that struggles to leave room for like, what's the bigger picture here? And I think having buildings that are capable of being adapted and evolving over time, with those panels able to be repurposed and reused, and using standard parts that are then able to go into this circular economy, but they're not restricting designers with their kind of creative freedom to design beautiful buildings, because you can use bespoke bits. In some ways, we have been accused of overcomplicating it. It is a highly engineered product. But actually, we think this represents the next generation of construction kind of innovation, and really a new way of doing things, rather than just tinkering around the margins of the way we've always done things.
I don't think the complexity thing's an issue. I've got a mobile phone. It's an incredibly complex bit of engineering. I just use it for calling people, texting, and taking photos. So it's good. The other thing is, it intrigues me about what you just said is some of it's what I call the Greg vegan sausage roll thing. I can remember when a bunch of us had sausage rolls, but we were on site doing something, and somebody got some sausage rolls from Greg's. Turns out they were all vegan sausage rolls. None of us noticed. If they'd handed them saying, I can only get vegan sausage rolls, we probably were all sitting there going, oh, really? None of us noticed that they weren't a real sausage roll. So kind of how you present what you do matters as well. So I think, how much of this, of the hippie stuff, have you dragged into this? Because you've secured really significant funding on this. And I kind of can't believe that it can be done on a sort of like right on sort of the best thing. The commercial and technical aspects of this, the funders are in there for a reason, even if we don't, and there may be ethical funders. But I think the other thing is that you're right. I think the market, looking at the market, if you're a shareholder-driven business building buildings, then you will operate in a fairly predictable way. But you're not in that market. So I wanted to ask you about how you attracted the funders. What was the view you gave them? Because they're fairly hard-nosed about this, even ethical funders.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the challenge is always, if you're looking at disrupting an industry, that there's a high level of skepticism, and being in the construction industry, there's a high level of kind of risk associated with it. Being associated with modular or modern methods of construction, even in itself, has a lot of, connotations and challenges.
Are you a modern method of construction?
I would say we really are a modern method of construction. The irony is that, like, lots of the kind of what is considered modern methods of construction, I would say, are the same methods of construction, but just done in a barn, which to me isn't exactly modern.
Or SIPs, or,
Exactly. But I think, obviously, being a disruptor or someone that is doing something differently, there is a higher threshold in terms of proving out the kind of commercial validation of the idea. And I think we were very lucky to have a kind of chunk of investment early on that enabled us to get to where we are, that really was, again, a kind of purpose driven, and able to get us to a point where we've proven our ability to deliver projects in a number of different contexts. And I think that, we've done small projects that we've proved, and we've been building up gradually. We're just in manufacturing now with our first full house, and then we've got a 2-story house we're doing later this year, and hopefully that's paving the way to the scale of opportunity and commercial investment that investors are looking for. But look, I mean, the VC world and the private equity world, and they're all, it's a kind of form of gambling. They're basically hedging their bets. They're looking for innovation where it's innovative, but there's already someone else that's done it, so that they know that that's a surefire bet. Like, that's really what they're looking for. Or they're looking for a simple widget that solves, small solution, big problem. That's what they want. And that basically makes complexity something that is a harder thing to grapple with. But I think ultimately, when you look at the scale of the housing crisis and the climate crisis and the urgency of the need there, having something that can be deployed rapidly that could address those challenges is not just an imperative for the climate, but it's also a massive commercial opportunity. And those things don't need to be mutually exclusive. In fact, that's really what we are trying to demonstrate, is you can do sustainable house building at scale affordably and tick the boxes that the investors and the clients want to see without compromising the planet.
So, and was this what appealed to them? Because, I mean, obviously, having been through certain funding in the past myself, not to the same scale as you have, there's a lot of box ticking, but it's not necessarily the box ticking that makes their mind up. That's the qualification to get in. It's the bit that appeals. So, was it the mass market side of this? It was its ability to be scaled. Was that what they were really looking at, do you think?
I think that's definitely one of the USPs, is that this is not a product that is confined to a particular kind of use case. It's not, we were very aware in the beginning, we did quite a few garden studios, but, we were never planning on being a garden studio company. And so I think that it's the kind of potential for the bigger scale, addressing low-rise residential, obviously housing crisis significant, and therefore that's a massive opportunity. But we did attract interest and support from the more sustainability focused investors and smaller people in that space. And we've been very lucky getting grant support from Innovate UK in particular, and also being accepted onto a number of kind of accelerators and programs that have really helped us to cut our teeth in the kind of commercial world.
So I mean, you have won lots of awards, and you have been very well recognised. And you now have, and for those people who've been to Future Build or any of the exhibitions you've been at, they've actually seen the Adept system there. It's up, you can see it, you can touch it, you can feel it. What about the other end of the scale? What about the customers, the people who you can sell to? You've obviously had a very receptive audience in the funding side of it. There's lots of us who are very enthusiastic and big supporters of yours because we can see what you're trying to do. But what about the people who are actually going to use this? How does the sales message change to them?
Yeah, I mean, as you'll be well familiar with, Will, the challenge with the construction industry is that, the person you're selling to isn't necessarily your client, which is, there's very few places where that's the case. What we find generally is that architects and designers immediately understand the value of what we're doing, in terms of both it being something that addresses their clients' desires in terms of sustainability, but also it de-risks using these materials for them, and it hopefully means that they don't have to keep reinventing the wheel on every single project and redoing every junction detail on every, because of variations in material compositions. The idea is that we're front loading the complexity of building design into the kind of pre-design and fabrication process, but also giving them flexibility. So we find that generally we get a great deal of traction there, but obviously they aren't the people generally paying the bill. And I think the end users where we see the most value is anyone who has a long-term interest in that building, because having a building that is designed to make it easy to take apart and adapt in the future, it lends itself more to social housing providers, it lends itself more to self-builders, it lends itself more to people who will really get the benefits of living in a building that has a better quality material fabric performance, basically. The challenge we have is that joining the dots up between the large scale commercial opportunity in terms of residential house builders and where we are now is that there is a massive hurdle of certification and compliance demonstration in the way. It's huge, and it's not something that we've managed to fully overcome. We've focused really on kind of demonstrating our compliance with building regulations and kind of showing testing to particular specs for certain projects. But that's a challenge that comes with our system being hyper flexible in terms of any internal external finish, it's got to be able to demonstrate it can meet required fire performance, which means anytime someone wants to use a different internal or external finish, in theory, we have to retest it. And that's a very expensive process. So it's a huge challenge.
It is a challenge. So I just want to actually something on a practical side of it. So effectively, if you're talking about, we're talking below 11 meters. We're typically talking about sort of domestic sized dwellings. And the whole wall structure. What do you do in a building of yours with the ground floor and the roof? Because I'm not sure that you can build the roof out of your panel system, can you?
Well, you can, but what we found is as we've so when we were doing garden studios, it makes total sense. We've got a kind of panel that's equivalent to the wall panel that you put on a French cleat split batten that you can hang as a roof cassette. And if you're building something that you might want to take apart in 5 or 10 years, it makes total sense. But when you start looking at bigger buildings that are designed to be permanent, or as permanent as any building is, the additional cost. So the panels are designed so that the 2 people can manually lift them. So that's something that sets us apart from some of the other modular systems, is we've always wanted to be able to work with constrained and awkward access sites. And I think that for doing bigger projects where you do have good access, it's just much cheaper and more efficient to use a more conventional I-joist style solution. You can still prefabricate them into panels, but we basically found it's more cost efficient to use a fiber filled I-joist approach than it is to use the panels themselves. But really, it depends on the project. So we kind of appraise and do the feasibility on a project by project basis. Obviously, suspended timber floors in general, the UK insurance industry don't tend to like.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of our system, is that we can integrate it, with other solutions and systems. We're not, it doesn't have to all be made out of it.
You're a standard width, aren't you? 600 mil.
Yeah, every panel 600 as the standard size. We can do bespoke bits for infill pieces and things, but so most of the projects we're doing that are residential are predominantly just looking at the walls, because that's effectively the bit where our panels kind of fit the most and have the best benefits.
And in terms of building performance, you exceed building regs with your standard panel and the standard finish for all of it. So, and how close do you get if you were building out of yours to passive standard? Do you build inherently airtight buildings using the system?
Yeah, so the way it works is you install the panel, and then there is an external layer of rigid wood fiber. So that's basically the bit that you vary to get the different U values. So for smaller projects, garden studios and things where no one's going to be sleeping in it, you can get away with using effectively the non-structural version of our panel. So the primary panel we have that I mentioned has the 2 layers of insulation materials in it. It's a structural panel up to 3 stories, and it can be individually removed. But if you're making a garden studio, in some ways it's overperforming in terms of what you need the building to do. So you can get away with a single skin panel that doesn't have the fiber insulation in it. It just has the hemp sil material. And then either way, you add a layer of rigid wood fiber, and that helps with thermal breaks. And it also means you can basically customize the thermal performance per project. So the panels are standardized, but the build-up can vary.
The build-up, great. And again, the width of the panels would be typically range from,
panels are always 600 wide.
Sort of the smallest size right up to what? I don't know, 400?
So the panels are always 600 wide, and then the height increments are in 300s.
And the wall depth?
And all that, so the external wall is 175, but we also have a 100 mil version and 125, and we do technically have a 75 mil version, but I'd say that's more just for internal partitions rather than external walls. But yeah, the idea is you've got standardized panels, but flexibility in the overall build-up. And then just a note on the air tightness. So we use the vapor board as the internal face of the panel, and we tape all the joints. So that's effectively our air tightness layer. So we try and avoid using membranes as much as possible. Obviously, we have to protect the wood fiber externally. And if someone really wanted to, or building control insisted, we can use a membrane, but we just generally try and avoid mechanical fixings and petrochemical materials as much as is feasible, recognizing that, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to not use a plastic pipe fitting connection or whatever.
So we're all trying to avoid plastic as much as possible, but I'm intrigued by this as well, because in terms of cost. So you've got speed of erection, which is one of your big wins. You've got inherently well-performing buildings, effectively performing to passive standard, both in air tightness and thermal management. You've got a building that will actually, through its own structure and its material buildup, help manage and mitigate moisture. I'm intrigued. I remember you saying something to me about how hemp regulates moisture.
Yeah.
Remind me of what that was, because the hemp has something peculiar about it, a feature about the product itself, about the regulation of water.
Yes. Water, so it's just it's a kind of a natural byproduct of the pore structure of the shiv part of the crop. So it's got a triple pore structure, and lots of Mike's published researches on this. And it basically concentrates moisture vapor into the pores of the material, and it causes the exchange between water and moisture vapor. And the way I explain it, because I'm not really a technical person, is the way when you perspire, when you sweat, it cools you down. Well, that process of an exchange between a gas and a liquid basically releases energy, and it cools the material. So what it means on a practical level is that hemp composites have a thermal mass that is many times greater than its physical mass. So when you go into a hemp building, it will have qualities of a denser, people use stone and concrete, and I like the kind of church versus caravan examples of, one is a building that has a very stable internal temperature and will stay very cool, and the other, it might be okay at keeping heat in, but if the external temperature increases, it doesn't stop that heat getting into your building as efficiently. And that's something that hemp basically is a perfect kind of middle ground. And it also just purely coincidentally keeps the relative humidity in the building at 55%, which is also the sweet spot for human inhabitants in terms of reducing mold growth and kind of airborne pollution. And so it means it reduces the need for mechanical ventilation and cooling, and it keeps a stable, consistent temperature. So it delays, it's called the decrement delay, but it basically delays the time it takes for the peak outside temperature to reach the inside of your building. And all of this is just an inherent byproduct of its natural pore structure. So to my knowledge, there are other bio-based materials that do it a little bit, and obviously all breathable materials, natural materials, have some benefits in this vein, but nothing to the same extent as hemp shiv.
I mean, it's a really interesting. We were talking internally with, I was talking with some of our people who are involved with our digital marketing, and one of the ideas that we came up with for an advert, which we may well do, was basically to sell phase shift, decrement delay, decrement factor, whatever you want to call it, but all the features of natural insulation, standing it up against a synthetic insulation, and then basically saying, this is what you buy. Oh, and by the way, we'll chuck in the thermal performance for free. So you get the thermal performance for nothing because you're buying all these additional features. And I mean, is that, I don't know how receptive people would be to that, but I certainly think that there's also a difference between how interested people are and how willing they are to act upon that interest.
Well, the key is, does it cost you any more? And that's the thing that, is really, at the end of the day, the deal breaker, like the sustainability.
Is it always the deal breaker? You can't upsell the value?
No, of course you can, but I think at the end of the day, it's kind of on a broader sense, sustainability is seen as a nice to have. Like, I would like to do it, but also I've got a budget that I have to stick to, kind of attitude is something that I think is quite prevalent. And the thing that we have demonstrated is that you can do it for equivalent cost. And I think doing it the way we have, which is front loading the complexity into a pre-certified system that is manufactured efficiently, that actually overcomes the problem is building with natural materials. I mean, you probably know more than I do, but there's about a 30% premium associated with building the same building out of nice natural materials versus kind of conventional plastic foam or whatever. But we know, because we've done projects where we've seen the competitive tendering process that happened and the price that would have been charged for a plastic foam SIPs building, and we've delivered ours for the same. So, we're doing that on a very small scale.
We're getting back to the Greggs vegan sausage roll thing here, aren't we? If you don't, effectively, I suppose the intriguing part about this is when, because a lot of our customers at Eco Merchant are already committed to all of this. So kind of the people I'm most interested should be the people who are not selling to. I think the guy's Christian name was Noriaki, but the Kano model of attributes. So you've got in basically there's lots of different versions of it, but broadly speaking, there could be three: utility, performance, and what he calls delight. So the utility value is supposing you were to have something where, I don't know, the packaging didn't work, or it constantly failed at doing something. So in other words, it's got to do what it's got to do. Then the performance, which could be all the attributes you've just said. It's got to, it has a thermal performance, it has moisture, etc. There is also the so-called delight attribute, which is the bit that is missed in the building chain, because it's the beneficiary is the occupant, not the builder, the constructor, or the architect. So the more comfortable, cheaper to run, better air quality home that has a sawtooth internal temperature profile rather than the roller coaster is something that's quite difficult to sell. And yet what you're describing delivers exactly that for the same price. One would be forgiven for thinking this is a no-brainer. Why aren't we all doing it?
That's why I'm doing it.
Chloe, why aren't we all doing it? Where does this come unstuck? Is it the fact that this is possibly new or different? Is that part of what it is? And that actually, if now for Lafarge or somebody else had done this, people would be going, oh, actually, that's a pretty bloody good idea. We'll have a go at it. Yeah?
Yeah, I think it's obviously being in a innovative space in a risk-averse industry is a challenge. Convincing people that it does what we claim it does, and obviously investing in the evidence-based lab research, and kind of, the thing is showing, the biggest game changer for us was being able to take people in a physical building we made. You're talking to people about the concept, people go, yeah. But once you're actually in a building and they go, oh, it is cool in here, and it does feel nice, and you go, yeah, that's what we were saying. I think that believing bit is really important, and that's why we've focused on incrementally building up what it is that we're delivering. But I think obviously there's the challenge, especially in the UK, is the kind of love affair we have with concrete and bricks, and elsewhere in Europe, bio-based materials are much more widely adopted. I think there's a real challenge with, I think our product is more suitable for existing contractors and builders to transition to more sustainable materials, because we're trying to give them a product that they can use rather than kind of displacing them with a bunch of blokes in a factory.
I think that's it as well. It's a new product, not a new skill. I do get cross with people who demean or belittle builders. Builders are people who are skilled sponges. They understand. So I do think this is the how did you enjoy your sausage roll, or did you enjoy the vegan sausage roll? That's what you're saying. You show people the house and say, what do you think of this? I do a presentation for architects and sometimes for specifiers, where I often feel a bit out of my depth. But it's actually a collection of customers that we've had who built houses, and it's about 30 houses crammed onto this one slide. And all the houses have two things in common. They're all timber frame and they're all passive. And you just can't tell by looking at them. There's everything from social housing to great big sort of grand design type things. So the experience that your customers had, and when you took people to the house, was if you hadn't told them how it was built, they would still have had the same experience physically. But the way you describe things and the way you sell it to them will reinforce that. Is that how you think you overcame the skepticism?
Yeah, 100%. I think one of our early projects, obviously some of the projects we did were client projects, so they were in people's gardens or in their private, we couldn't take people round to look at it per se. But we had a project that we got some funding for early on that we delivered that is at a university site it's at the BT Ad Astral site in Suffolk, where the University of Suffolk have a base. And there's a passive house, but plastic foam building right next to effectively a mini version that we did. And people being able to go into the two buildings, I think that did much, much more for validating our ability to produce a building that performs. And I mean, we built that 4 or 5 years ago now, and it's still, it's still doing just as well as it was on day one. And there's a researcher doing some monitoring and studying the actual performance of the materials in comparison to the house next door. The problem being we did it on a really tight budget, so there were some shortcuts we did, things like the windows don't open, things which with hindsight maybe we should have invented.
It's more like a film set.
It's 10 square meters, so it's tiny, but
Tiny, tiny, yeah.
that's kind of what I mean about the like you just have to have that validation and proof physically. And so that's why we're really excited that this year we'll be doing a two-story build inside a trade show so people can come along and experience it.
Tell us where the trade show is so that people can come and see it. Chloe,
It's an installer show that's up in June, up in Birmingham in late June, and we're working with a lot of the sponsors and basically products that would typically go to the show to show how we can combine them together in a house that is then a exemplar of low carbon sustainable building, both on integrating technology solutions and MEP type products, but also the fabric and kind of trying to make sure we're bringing in smaller, innovative companies as well as working with some of the
your usual collaborative idea. I mean, this to me would be that show in particular would be a really good showcase for shelf backwards thinking, because the majority of people you're going to be attracting will be interested in the process and the background and everything else, as you've told us all about your fascinating history so far. But in reality, what they're looking at is this for me? Can I afford it? How does it feel? How am I going to get on with? Can I persuade my builder to build like this? They're going to be asking all of those questions that people looking at the product on the shelf will ask, rather than the person pushing it out the factory is going to ask. I'll be really intrigued to see how you get on with it. We're coming towards the end of our time together today, Chloe, but it's been lovely having you. I just wanted to ask you a couple more. At the end of every one of these, I ask my guest 3 questions, which I've got. But before that, just let's wrap this up. So the key messaging here about the build system that you've created, what is it that the key messaging that you give to people that would cross both the design, build, supply to the customer side that describes the sort of universality of what you do?
Well, that's quite a big
it's a sort of wrap. You've got 3 sentences to describe your product. That sort of attitude to this.
Yeah, so it's a kit of parts for construction that is designed to bring the benefits of bio-based materials and the efficiencies of modern industrial manufacturing. And that means we can ultimately deliver a product that is healthier for the people, but also kinder to the planet. That's our kind of, in a nutshell.
Perfect. What's not to like? Look, I'm going to wrap this up, but thank you so much for your time. Now, I'm going to ask you these 2 questions. I always ask my guests one book that you've read that had a profound impact or really changed the way you thought about something that had an influence over you. Have you got a book recommendation for our listeners that they might want to read?
Yeah, it's not my usual reading, but I did really enjoy a book that I've just finished that's called Green Swans by an author called John Elkington. And it's basically, the subtitle is The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. And it's effectively a really hopeful story of how we're at this tipping point where the old kind of extractive and degenerative economic model, the linear economy that we live in is kind of coming to an end. And that at this inflection point, there are opportunities for exciting and regenerative, inclusive, resilient kind of business models and different ways of doing things. And that's what we're trying to build at Natural Building Systems, but also something that I hope and feel is inevitable in the wider economy. But this guy is a very well-renowned economist and one of the kind of fathers of the triple bottom line kind of capitalism, financial, ESG stuff, and I just found it very hopeful, and we need a bit more of that in the world. So
tell us the author and the book title again.
It's called Green Swans, and it's by John Elkington, and its subtitle is The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism.
I'm going to put it on my list, as will many others, no doubt. One piece of advice derived from your incredibly varied journey that you might want to pass on to another business or entrepreneur, where they a bit of a shortcut or a bit of profit for them that they would have otherwise learnt the hard way.
Yeah, I think embracing your naivety, because sometimes it can be a superpower, going into something maybe not understanding fully at the beginning, but I think really being focused on the why you're doing it rather than the what you're doing, because Natural Building Systems as it is now is not what I thought it would have been 5 years ago. It's quite a long way from that, but I think it's all the better for it. So yeah.
No, that's a very. I think that the point, I suppose, the point that I listened when I'm hearing you say that is you've got to understand that that's what's happening to you, and that's what hindsight gives you quite often. But if you can experience it in the moment, all the better. So the last one is any of the pivotal moments in your career where a shift really took place that changed the course of your work of the business. It might have been meeting somebody, for example, but I think that there was various guests that I've talked to before have had various different sort of almost like a tipping point where you suddenly get this sort of like, oh, I'm going to behave differently now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say obviously the kind of genesis of my interest in hemp was a massive tipping point. The workshop I went to that was kind of talking about hemp and its role in agriculture and its kind of potential power there, that was a massive tipping point. And I think also getting into when I first got into volunteering as a teenager, I was kind of slightly opinionated and a bit wayward, and my mum brought home a leaflet about the UK Youth Parliament, and I had no interest in politics, but it was a bit like, you've got opinions and maybe you should channel them into something structured and useful. And that really set the kind of wheels in motion for what I've ended up doing. And I didn't go to university. I've gone straight into business, and I'm very grateful for it. But little did I know that kind of one leaflet she picked up would have had such a big impact on my life. So probably that, I guess.
Chloe, Donovan, thank you so much. That rounds us off very, very nicely. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope you've enjoyed your time on Thinking Aloud.
It's been lovely catching up.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing everyone again next time.
Thanks so much.